Over the next 70 minutes or so, we will discuss linkages between transnational crime and terrorism in India. The subject is of immense policy relevance, but often overlooked in favor of other issues, most notably geopolitical rivalries. South Asia is one of the most geopolitically charged regions of the world, and organized crime cannot be understood without examining the role of state actors, not only in terms of corruption, but also in terms of instrumentalizing criminal entities for geopolitical ends. Organized crime is not merely a social menace, it has direct implications for Indian national security. One of the topics we will be discussing today is the 1993 synchronized bombings in Mumbai. Considered an archetypical example of crime-terror convergence, the event has been studied across the world, but the original crime-terror nexus was not forged in Mumbai in 1993. Rather, it appeared in Indian Punjab in the 1980s. A few radicalized elements of the Punjabi diaspora in Canada, the UK, and the US, representing no one but themselves, chose to sponsor religious violence and separatist terrorism on Indian territory. Taking advantage of the fact that the Pakistani city of Lahore was a hub for the heroin trade, they enlisted the services of drug traffickers to smuggle weapons and funds to criminals in Indian Punjab. The weapons were used for carrying out religious killings aimed at polarizing relations between Hindus and Sikhs, and for assassinating police officials and creating a climate of fear and terror. In response, the Indian government embarked on a massive border fencing project to interdict the dual threat of arms and drug trafficking. The two threats have gone together since the 1980s. Today, despite the significant reduction of violence in Indian Punjab to almost non-existent levels, persistent efforts are made to stoke terrorism in the false name of religious and ethnic separatism in Indian Punjab. Delivery systems have been automated. Today, drones are crossing the India-Pakistan border, dropping drugs and firearms into Indian territory. Our discussion will demonstrate how terrorists do not need a popular narrative nor mass support to carry out provocative attacks. All they need is an infrastructure for bypassing state vigilance and border security, an infrastructure which already exists in the form of transnational crime groups. We have two experts today who will share their insights of the crime-terror convergence in India. And we are also privileged to have a very distinguished discussant joining us as well. Our first speaker, Dr. Kartikeya Tripathi, is a lecturer at University College London. He previously worked as a journalist for 6 years in Mumbai, covering court trials of the local mafia. He also covered the trial of Ajmal Kasab, the sole surviving terrorist of the 26/11 Mumbai terrorist attacks. Our second speaker, Ms. Mikhaila Mitovtsiev, is a research analyst with the European Foundation for South Asian Studies. She has researched on South Asian geopolitics, terrorist activities, and terrorism financing. And as our lead discussant, we are extremely privileged to have Mr. Junaid Qureshi, the director of the European Foundation for South Asian Studies. Mr. Qureshi is uniquely placed to provide us with a panoptic view of the situation in South Asia. My first question will be to Dr. Tripathi. Sir, in the years since the 1993 attacks, Mumbai has seen other acts of terrorism, including the 26/11 attacks, which you covered. But in none of these was the role of the mafia as pronounced, at least according to publicly available information, as in 1993. Why was this?
Thank you, Prem, and good morning to everyone. When you mentioned my bio, I should also add that while I was working as a journalist, I covered the 1993 blast trial, which at that time seemed to go on forever and ever and ever before the verdict was pronounced. And it was a trial which had 123 accused persons, of which 100 were convicted of the charges brought against them by Mumbai police. And there was clearly a link between organized crime and terrorism. In this case, the role played by the Dawood Ibrahim gang in the 1993 blasts, serial blasts in Mumbai. Now, an important thing to get out of the way to start with is that it is very rare to be able to find that link between working of an organized crime syndicate and a terrorist act. Usually you don't find these links, and it's absolutely unique what happened in Mumbai, that an existing organized crime syndicate which had been flourishing, perhaps one of the strongest OC syndicates in Mumbai at the time, and continues to be really influential, So a well entrenched organized crime syndicate in the communities in Mumbai played a direct part in the terrorist attacks in Mumbai, and there was clearly a longer narrative and a story to it, which came out subsequently in their arrests and the trial. The reason I'm saying that is that organized crime generally does not like terrorism because and terrorists, especially state-sponsored terrorists, do not like organized crime, and the reasons for that are fairly simple. Organized crime knows that once they cross the boundary into terrorism, it brings the heat of the state of the police upon them like never before, and it makes their very existence very difficult, which is exactly what happened in the case of the 93 blast as well. The like I said, these were well run smuggling networks, and they existed under the eyes of all the law enforcement agencies, and there was a reason for it, because they kept to smuggling, which was an acceptable form of crime for many people. But the moment they took part in the 93 serial blast, the gang was the syndicate was almost wiped out by the Indian state. Most of their kingpins had to leave the country. Those who remained in the country were tried, convicted, sentenced to long years in prison. One of the conspirators was even hanged to death. Now, states don't like organized crime to support terrorist activities because it just exposes them. So the 93 blast clearly showed the entire part played by Pakistan's agencies in enabling this terrorist attack in India, because you arrested people who had gone to Pakistan, trained there. The agencies could put together a clear picture of how explosives were smuggled into India via ports in Gujarat, how they came in, and it really exposed the nature of the role played by Pakistan. Now, coming to subsequent terrorist attacks in Mumbai, and I covered a lot of them, their trials as well. The main in them would include the gateway bombing, which was carried out by a family which was actually radicalized in Dubai. There again, no clear role of organized crime. There was the bus blast in Ghatkopar, for which the entire trial was handled really badly by the police. There were the train blasts in the 7-Eleven train blasts, which I think were killed almost as many people as the 93 blast. And then you had the 26/11 attack. In between, there was a bombing of a McDonald's near Mumbai Central, where I think the people were injured, but there weren't any deaths. I may be wrong, but it was minor, as we can call it, terrorist attack, minor in comparison to other attacks that have taken place in Mumbai. Now, here in all these attacks, you could not see a clear fingerprint of the mafia or any organized crime terrorist group. And the question for me is really interesting, because I was struck by what you said in your opening remarks, that the organized crime syndicates used amongst the diaspora used organized crime in Pakistan, organized crime groups in Punjab to smuggle in explosives and smuggle in material to support their activity. So essentially what they were doing was that they were piggybacking on what the organized crime networks were doing to facilitate their goals, which was terrorism. Now, I think that in the other terrorist attacks, especially 7/11 and 26/11, 26/11, there were hardly any locals involved. There were the two other men who were tried along with Kasab. Both of them were acquitted. And the rest of the gunmen, as we know, were all killed. And the masterminds and the entire group which planned the conspiracy still sits in Pakistan, some of them in Pakistani jails. So the point I'm trying to make is that after a point, Pakistan also realizes that working with organized crime syndicates is a liability. And either it does it so well that Mumbai police has not been able to find the evidence, which I would doubt very much, or it it found ways to bypass them, because essentially what you're using the organized crime networks for is to facilitate the terrorist attack. And why would you go to them if you can do it by yourself with your own capabilities, and which is something that the Indian state really needs to think about. Again, it depends on in the trajectory of development of your skill set to carry out terrorist attacks in another country. You probably need the local organized crime groups when you are weaker in terms of carrying out the whole operation. So again, like with the diaspora abroad, they needed the gangs in Punjab because they themselves didn't have the long reach for them to be able to do it. Now, that's what I think. But again, what my discipline teaches me is that we must speak on the basis of evidence-based analysis. So what is the evidence? To come back to 93 blast, the evidence was so overwhelming and so many arrests were made and the story was so clear that there were no doubts left. But again, I would say that is kind of rare. And also it was happening at a time when the capability of terrorist groups based in Pakistan or the Pakistani state itself to carry out really sophisticated, well-synchronized attacks in India wasn't really that well developed. So I think the evidence, which we may never see, is to try and understand from the point of view of the perpetrator what is going on. Do they need the organized crime groups? Do they not need it? Do they need them, but they can bypass them? So I think that's where the discussion should go forward to illuminate this topic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tripathi. You raise an interesting, a number of very interesting points. And one that really struck me is the importance of intelligence information here. I mean, in the case of Punjab, I have actually seen police intelligence reports of a very low security classification, but still not meant for public viewing, which clearly bring out the organized crime link. But one doesn't often hear of this. One hears about other issues, political or historical issues, but the operational linkages, especially extending into Pakistan, are often not known. And who are the key players in Lahore as well? We would definitely be coming back to these points that you raised. But for a moment, I'd like to go to Ms. Mutovsiev, and our tendency is to look at organized crime and terrorism from a national perspective, India or Colombia or other parts of the world, but it's very country specific. If you were to look at South Asia as a whole, how would you see the linkages between organized crime and terrorism evolving within the region? Because these are transnational. How would you see those linkages evolving over the course of the next 5 years?
Thank you, Prem. Well, I think that first of all, that 5 years is a very short period. So seeing what is going on in South Asia today, I would say that probably the situation would stay the same or maybe even get worse. This is because of main 4 reasons. So first of all, terrorism is proliferating in the region as well as criminal activities, and terrorist organizations and criminal groups maintain a business relationship, basically. Money and transactions today are getting more and more controlled by states, especially the use of cash. And finally, we also believe that the projects of the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government could even facilitate terrorism and criminal activities in the region. So I will go into more details now. Well, we have seen terrorism proliferating in these past few years. So we can think of a major example in Afghanistan in 2021 with the Taliban takeover. But even in Pakistan, it's known that Pakistan is involved in creating and financing terrorist organizations in the region to act and to reach Pakistan's own geopolitical agenda. So we can think about Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Tariq-e-Taliban, Pakistan, who act both in Pakistan and in India. Also, in 1999, Benazir Bhutto's Minister of Interior explicitly said we created the Taliban. We have evidence there about Pakistan government and also the military establishment involvement in terrorist activities in the region. And in India, sadly, also terrorist activities are very active. Only in 2021, in Jammu and Kashmir, there have been 153 attacks. And also, again, Pakistan is involved here because hundreds of Kashmiris trained in Pakistan and came back to Kashmir to act as terrorists. Then organized crime is also proliferating in the region. India has decreasing levels of organized crime in these past few years, but still worryingly high. Pakistan has mafia-style organized criminal groups that are involved in drug trafficking, environmental crimes, racketeering and extortion activities. And Afghanistan is also sadly known for its opium trade, which the Taliban exploited for many years, and now that they took over, they're trying to stop it. So all these criminal groups probably have relationships with terrorist organizations. This is probably to put a solution to a problem of money control from the states, because countries are introducing more and more controls on the use of cash, and even cryptocurrencies are becoming more popular. So both terrorist organizations and criminal groups need more money laundering activities, and this could probably create a link between these two issues and groups. Terrorists, all in Pakistan, every year $10 billion are laundered, and we can well imagine where they come from and what they will finance. So terrorist organizations anyway always exploited criminal activities, especially in drug trafficking. Again, for example, in Afghanistan, the Taliban and the opium trade. Finally, we believe the Belt and Road Initiative and the Belt and Road infrastructure projects developed by China in the region, especially in Afghanistan and Pakistan, could actually facilitate terrorism and organized crime. This is because these groups could use these infrastructures for their own benefit and taking advantage for illicit enterprises, but also so China is carrying out these projects using Chinese companies and bringing Chinese workers. So the indigenous people are letting completely out of the job market, and they're only seeing their land exploited to build these huge infrastructures. So we are worried that this could increase a feeling of anger, and this could very well be used by terrorist groups and exploit this feeling of anger of the population to recruit more militants.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mutawsiev. Your answer demonstrates that in this day and age, actually, the quality of analysis that one is capable of delivering is actually of a very high level. I must compliment you, because that was, I think, a very good summary of the situation in South Asia. I have a number of follow-up questions. So I have a question for Dr. Tripathi. So when it comes to the Mumbai Mafia, of course, the image that we often have is from Bollywood films and so on. Actually, in terms of actual studies, I mean, I know of no scholar other than yourself who's actually working on the Mumbai Mafia from an academic point of view. So a question which I'd like to ask you is, we've often heard about the drugs connection, Dawood Ibrahim as a drug trafficker, but everything that is usually reported about him talks of gold smuggling in the old days, from the Middle East, and then subsequently about protection rackets and Bollywood and so on. So my question to you is, how deeply was the Mumbai mafia, whether it was Dawood Ibrahim's gang or any other groups as well, how deeply were they involved in the international drug trade?
I mean, that's a good question. So Dawood Ibrahim gang still remains one of the largest narcotic smuggling, narco terrorist organizations in the world. I think the FBI has them on their list as the most dangerous narco terrorist groups in the world. But see, the point here, which I think connects back to the question on terrorism, is that organized crime syndicates are generally flexible if they want to survive. So they are trying to meet a particular need, right? And the way they operate is that they are clever enough to exploit the systemic shortcomings or failures within an economic system to fill in a gap in the market. So how does it start with gold and silver smuggling? Gold and silver smuggling in India flourished at the time when the duties on the import of gold, when the restrictions on the amount of gold that you could import were so severe that it just made more sense both for the public and for the mafia to just smuggle it in and get access to gold and silver. That goes back. So if you see the earliest big organized crime groups in Mumbai, such as Haji Mastan, they were smuggling in electronic goods. You know, your 2-in-1 cassette recorders, and then subsequently video VCRs, etc. Right? How did their business collapse when the government just legalized it, and when a number of electronic companies, both Indian and multinational, started selling these goods at competitive prices in the market? So the issue is that with the drugs will always remain a huge market for organized crime everywhere because of just the profits that are to be made and the demand which exists for us. So there was this Afghan I think politician who had said, Americans should understand that we won't sell you the drugs if you won't buy them. So the point is that there is always a huge market for drugs and illegal market with massive profits to be made, which brings in the organized crime network. Now, coming back to the question of the Dawood gang, it is not just a narcotics operation anymore. It has diversified into much else. So, for example, the real estate, again, a highly regulated industry in Mumbai where the rules that govern the development of real estate infrastructure in the city are far behind times of what is happening in reality, when you have this really growing economy, a massive middle class, a large number of professionals who are getting good salaries. But Mumbai is a sliver of land, and there just isn't enough housing going around, right? And it's just very hard to develop for real estate property developers to build. So these are the kind of places where the mafia, the underworld, really steps in, and they realize. So we have this kind of selection bias where we only look at gangs which are operating and flourishing and doing well. What we forget is that over the years, for every organized crime syndicate that works out of Mumbai, or I would say anywhere else, there would be 10 others who disappeared, right? Either they were taken out by the police, or they were taken out by the other gangs, or their business just dried up. Now, organized crime syndicates, especially the successful ones, are always very aware of the fact that just like any other business, they can go out of business unless they diversify. And those who survive are the ones who moved very quickly from one opportunity to another, right? Or strengthen themselves in the space where the money is good. And the gangs that survive in Mumbai are very good at doing that. And just one more point. While I was a journalist, I covered this really interesting case where this bank employee, young but I think fairly senior, in a private multinational bank in Mumbai, was arrested, and I think he was subsequently sentenced to 7 or 10 years in prison under Makoka, the Organized Crime Act. And he was doing something very simple. He was just passing on information of high net worth individuals to the Dawood Ibrahim gang for purposes of extortion. So the point I'm making is that it was something that was kind of like a blind spot for the police and for everybody who works on organized crime syndicates, because you wouldn't really expect a guy making good salary, good life, working directly for Dawood Ibrahim gang, because our image of the Dawood Ibrahim gang would remain as, people calling up Bollywood producers, threatening them, smuggling things, shooters, etc., etc., etc. No, this was a upper middle class, well-educated guy with a decent salary, working directly for the syndicate, which again shows that organized crime groups which survive and thrive and grow and continue to have a presence are doing so by moving into multiple areas of opportunity. So cryptocurrency came up, definitely cybercrime, right? And mostly for them, the governing motive is profitability and survival. So if you look at that framework, we will begin to understand more about how they think and how they collaborate with other state agencies, or choose not to participate in terrorist acts.
Thank you, Dr. Tripathi. You raised a number of interesting points. There are two particularly stood out. One, you were talking about people who sometimes don't meet our expectations or our profile of someone who's involved in organized crime being involved. And second, the police having a blind spot. On the first point, actually, if you look at, say, Indo-Canadian organized crime now, the Punjabi gangs who are active in British Columbia and Vancouver and who are actually involved in violence in Indian Punjab, allegedly, but there are some serious reports on this. One of the interesting things is that they are accused of commissioning contract killings in Indian Punjab to destabilize the politics of the province. And this is interesting because it often flies under the radar. If contract killings are carried out, but there's no explosion or bomb blast or something like that, people may not necessarily report it. It becomes a tragedy for the family, and people around may understand what's happening. The police would know. But this is one way that organized crime might fly under the radar. Also, interestingly, some of these Indo-Canadian gangs actually don't consist of what we would also consider a typical gangster. Some of these people are relatively well off. I wouldn't say they're rich, because that's not true, but they're definitely not completely poor and destitute. It's like they get into this almost because of the thrill of knowing that they're in a safe haven, that there are international restrictions in coming after them and so on. The point that you made about the police blind spot, I remember reading an analysis by DC Pathak, former director, Intelligence Bureau, who said that actually the Mumbai 1993 blasts were the first time that the Indian security establishment considered organized crime as a national security threat. Until then, it was very much a police problem. It was very localized. But that sort of completely changed the perspective. I would like to ask a question of Ms. Mutavsiev, if I may. Dr. Tripathi had raised this point about, something that is not expected, because organized crime is actually, there are interests which will be undermined if you get involved in terrorism. Now, with both the 1993 Mumbai blast as well as the killing of Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1991, the initial response was, why would this happen? Why would Dawood Ibrahim attack Mumbai, his own home base? And why would the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE, kill the Indian Prime Minister and alienate the entire Indian state as well as the people of Tamil Nadu? We all know it did happen. Dawood Ibrahim did carry out the blasts, and the LTTE did assassinate Rajiv Gandhi, the former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. So there have been reports now that drug cartels in the AFPAC region are building ties with remnants of the LTTE, and that these are coming through Pakistan. Have you, in all your research in the region, come across any information about this potential linkage between Tamil militants, whether in Sri Lanka or elsewhere, and Afghan drug cartels, Afghan Pak drug cartels?
So I will be very honest. To be honest, no, I haven't come across any information about this. I don't know if Mr. Qureshi has, but yeah.
I understand. But then, if we look at the drugs angle specifically, if I may, I wanted to ask you, in your assessment, is the drugs and terrorism link, drugs and terrorism, is that link more a localized one, or is it something which occurs at a regional level? Because if it's localized, it can be opportunistic. It's basically, some gang leader looking to how to increase his revenue, essentially. But if it's regional, then it's more systematic. Then we can even potentially look at the role of state actors facilitating the relations between drug cartels and terrorist groups. So your thoughts on that?
I think it's definitely at regional level, not just at local level. And it's not that criminal groups need terrorist organizations, while I think it's more the opposite. It's that terrorist organizations need to act with criminal activities and to collaborate with criminal groups to finance their work, their activities. So I think it's definitely a regional level. Again, we've seen it, for example, in Afghanistan with the opium trade. It's not just a local level; it's a huge market that many different organizations exploit.
Thank you, Ms. Matavsiev. If I may, I would like to advance a thesis or a suggestion out there, and an idea out there, and then get your responses from the two speakers as well as the discussant. And also then I would invite you to ask questions of each other. So if you look at the Dawood Ibrahim gang in particular, and you look at some of the guys who are involved in fomenting violence in Indian Punjab, I mean, the key element is that they are transnational, actually. And that element of having a safe haven somewhere I would suggest, I would hypothesize, it can loosen the restrictions that traditional local organized crime faces if you are city-based, right? If you're based in a city, you're running protection rackets, you're controlling the docks or whatever, there are serious problems if you get involved in terrorist activities. But in the case of Dawood Ibrahim, we know he was not in India during the time of the blast. In fact, he had been out of India for several years. And in the case of some of the most active and militant elements of the Punjabi mafia in Canada, it's the same with them, actually. You know, they have a safe haven. And also another element which I would like to raise is the 1993 blasts were clearly atypical. But as far as I'm aware, Dawood Ibrahim did not claim responsibility for the attack. Actually, he denied responsibility. And this element of terrorist groups or even, any actor denying responsibility for an attack is sometimes overlooked. I mean, if you remember, even Lashkar-e-Taiba denied responsibility for the 2008 Mumbai attacks, right? So the point that I would like to put out there for discussion, perhaps we can come back to it later, is that organized crime can be potentially involved in terrorist activity if it serves to destabilize a region, if it serves to distract the police, put pressure on them to focus on, say, political surveillance rather than going after criminal elements. It can do this provided the masterminds of this activity are really safe abroad. And it's just the local foot soldiers who, as we know, in India's political economy, can be hired, sometimes without fully knowing what they're getting into as well. So there can be corruption or there can just be simple payoffs to local mercenaries to engage in criminal activities. I have a question, if I may, for Dr. Tripathi, and that is, when it comes to to Dawood Ibrahim in particular, now, until 1993, there was a heavy level of involvement on the part of, not involvement, but let's say proximity between him and the Indian film industry, Bollywood, cricketers. They all didn't mind being seen in his presence. After that, it stops completely. Would it be correct to say that until 1993, he was seen something as something of, a rogue element, but not necessarily an anti-national element, right? So there wasn't that same moral view of, or sort of moralistic view of him that would be applied, say, in other cultures, perhaps. Like I'm thinking of the United States, where gangsters are stigmatized in popular discourse. But in the case of India, it seemed that until he carried out this attack, he was almost like a Robin Hood style figure. And that changed. Would that be correct, sir?
Okay, so I've been listening to various things you've been saying, and there are a couple of interesting takeaways. In order to understand the working of an organized crime syndicate, you have to begin, for me, or you have to begin by understanding that they have two clear goals. One is survival, and the other is profitability. And those are both linked to each other, because running organized crime operations requires huge profits, right? It's lucrative because of the profits. You don't pay any tax on the money that you make. Usually you make money in large amounts. And then you can start using this money to invest it in other legitimate businesses, right? So you can go into films, you can go into real estate, you can go into, malls, all these things that gang mafia, organized crime syndicates in Mumbai have done and continue to do so. The reason for that is that they're worried about their survival and the profitability. So in case of Dawood Ibrahim gang getting involved in terrorism, that caught everybody off guard, and it was a huge intelligence failure because there was nothing that predicted that he would do so, right? Because doing it threatens both those things: survival and your business operations and profitability. Because at some level, everybody knows that you're crossing a line, right? Beyond which the state will not tolerate you. And all the previous operations, including smuggling, working with Bollywood, financing films, etc., were done quite openly. I mean, it wasn't like, and they were large scale operations and they were completely, the state tolerated it. Agents of the state made vast amounts of money from the corruption and the proceeds that came from it. Everybody was happy, right? So this is what we've heard. In the gang itself, Dawood himself was reluctant to carry out the 93 blast, but because of the previous communal rioting and everything that was going on, he started receiving clear messages from his support base that if they did not act in the name of religion, then their very existence would be threatened. So it comes back to the first point. All organized crime bosses and gangs want to survive. And when they realize that their existence is threatened, they must act. And the other thing that happened personally for him was that that Memon started coming across as the more jihadi element of the group who was committed to avenging what had happened in the riots and therefore challenged his position. So he was in a situation where he had to act. Now, this was very cleverly exploited by ISI and Pakistan because at that time, I think they did not have the ability to carry out synchronized blasts in Mumbai by bringing in large amounts of RDX weaponry, challenging the state. They didn't have the means to do it independently from Pakistan, right? They needed a local player, and this situation was there, and the local player was ready, and they carried it out, and it was planned and executed over several months. Now, why did Mumbai police miss something as big as that happening from an entity which they clearly knew existed, had links with it, right? Had intelligence upon it. They were just like, as organic as anything else in Mumbai for Mumbai police. And that is a level of planning and operational secrecy and failure of the intelligence agencies, which is, I think, unprecedented. And it kind of woke up, like you said, the police to the fact that organized crime can pose a national security threat. They are not completely rational actors. But you have to come back. The rationality there for Dawood was to survive. Now, the other point that you raised about Punjabi gangs, Punjabis who form gangs in Canada and carry out assassinations and contract killings in India, what would need to be looked at is what is the attitude of the state where they're based, right? So in the case of 93 blast, it was quite clear that the attitude of the state, in this case, which is Pakistan, was to use them and support them and facilitate. So what is the Canadian government doing? You can have multiple, you can take multiple approaches. One is you can be against it and you can take them out. Right, easy enough for any well-established state and police to do so. I'm sure Canada is completely capable of it. The other is support them because you want to destabilize another country by using these guys as proxy, which again, we don't know whether Canada wants to do that or not. Or third, just ignore them. which is what seems to be happening, or let them be because it has some sort of political or instrumental gains for you. In case of Mumbai, it's different because what 26/11 attack showed was that how much things have changed from 1993 to 2008. In those 15 years, the same ISI did not need that much local support in order to carry out an extremely well organized, sophisticated attack with weapons, with explosives. It could do so by itself, right? And again, if we were to take the learning from Mumbai to Punjab, a good thing to understand is that organized crime comes into terrorism, and when the states which are sponsoring terrorism are at different stages of sophistication. So, if their capabilities haven't developed to execute it by themselves using just their own agents, a minimal footprint where they can control everything, they would have to turn to local actors. And like you said, local actors are for hire, local actors are easily available. You can exploit political divisions, you can exploit communal situations, you can exploit the difference between communities in order to do it. And I think with Punjab, that's the stage which is where it is at, and something that we can learn from the previous experience.
Thank you, Dr. Tripathi. If I might just pick up on one point that you mentioned regarding the attitude of the state in the case of particularly the Punjabi mafia in Canada. Now, in light of ongoing events, there's of course a lot of discussion about what the history is actually. And one interesting detail which is often overlooked is that we all know about the Kanishka bombing, which took place on the 23rd of June 1985. An Indian airliner was downed over the Atlantic, killing 329 passengers. The bomb in that case was planted, or the mastermind of that attack was a Canadian citizen of Indian Punjabi origin. Now, he was never charged, or he was never prosecuted and convicted by the Canadian government, even though he had been under surveillance. In the year 2000, a former Canadian intelligence official revealed that the official had personally erased wiretap evidence, which could have led to a conviction of this man because they wanted to protect sources and methods and so on. So essentially, there was no real justice for the masterminds of the attacks, and there was no justice for the victims. Eventually, the mastermind ended up traveling to India to carry out more terrorist attacks, and the Punjab police killed him there. But the point that I'm trying to make is, although we live in a post-9/11 world, it does seem that some certain governments, perhaps out of political compulsion, perhaps out of disagreements over extradition procedures and what constitutes evidence and how reliable the evidence is, sometimes governments really do not cooperate in shutting down transnational crime and terrorist networks. And I think, for the sake of politeness, we shouldn't forget this reality as well. It's not that governments will automatically respond to extradition requests or requests for security cooperation from one another. A question to Ms. Mutavsiev, and then I would invite the speakers to pose questions to each other. So, ma'am, you had talked about China's Belt and Road Initiative and the possible linkages that could have to crime. Now, in the case of the Mumbai attacks, the 26/11 Mumbai attacks, it was reported by David Headley, one of the guys who was involved in the attacks, that the mastermind of the attack, Sajid Majid or Sajid Mir, who's a Pakistani national, had developed linkages and contacts with smugglers along the maritime routes between India and Pakistan. And he used that knowledge, at least to some level, to plan this attack. So my question to you is now, if you look at the China-Pakistan economic corridor and the significant Chinese investments in Baluchistan and so on, we know that there is an increase of drug traffic coming out of the Makran coast of Pakistan. Do you think there could be a risk of maritime terrorism as well coming out of that region? Because the drug traffickers could potentially link up with the smugglers and look at high value targets to hit at sea, whether it's shipping or oil rigs. Do you have any sense of whether that is a risk? This is a question also to you primarily, but also to Mr. Qureshi if he wishes.
Yeah, I think that there definitely is a risk. This doesn't mean that it will happen. but there is a risk because of all these huge new infrastructures, and there is a risk that terrorist organizations and criminal groups will take advantage of it. And of course, as you said, all the oil industry, for example, it's very attractive for these groups. So I don't know if Mr. Qureshi wants to add something, but I think it should be monitored by states. Also, I think states should monitor and should make justice for against criminal organizations and terrorist groups in a simultaneous way. And in case of maritime attacks, it will be very needed.
Absolutely. I mean, if I may point out, I remember I once had a discussion with an official, with a high-ranking Indian security official, and we were talking about maritime terrorism risks in particular. And one of the problems is they're pretty hard to investigate, actually, because if something happens on the high seas, then there are all kinds of questions about who's actually going to take the responsibility of carrying out the investigation. Second, how do you recover evidence if it's at the bottom of the ocean, which is the logical thing for people to do, So thank you very much for that. I would invite the speakers to ask questions of each other. Dr. Tripathi, do you have any questions from Ms. Mutavsiye?
Yes, I mean, just before I was just listening to what Michaela said, and the thought, which I guess needs further kind of deliberation, is that the question that the Indian state has to ask itself is that when you know that the existence of organized crime groups carries the risk of their operations and their membership being exploited to carry out terrorist attacks, why are we tolerating them? So a part of the answer also is in realizing that the organized crime groups generally work generally work quite openly. They have links with officials of the state. Like I said, there's corruption. Their operations generally are facilitated by the manner of the way in which laws are framed, procedural issues, etc., etc. So, do we wait for them to become, terrorist threats, and they're fine until then? It's a big question. I mean, of course, acting against them requires a lot of efficiency, a lot of motivation, a lot of shaking up of the security and political infrastructure, because the organized crime groups are quite deeply embedded within socio-political and economic systems. But, they do carry with them a risk of turning into something that we don't like. So why don't we, start looking at them as a threat before they actually do something to be called a national security threat? So again, the whole issue with gangs in Canada operating in Punjab, we just can't say that, they are sitting there being supported by the Canadian state and carrying out assassinations in Punjab. What is it that's happening in Punjab? Okay, so there is an element you don't have control over, or complete control over, which is transnational and in another country. But there is an element which you have complete control over, because it is within your country. Your security agencies know their DNA completely well. If you go and have an honest chat about them, they will also know how they themselves are operation. So someone needs to think at a policy level, how long do we want to tolerate them, and how long do we want to wait? Or is it that we act only after something really bad has happened? And that's a big question. My question for Michaela would be, I've been deeply interested in Afghanistan, the political situation there, and how it happens for years now. And my question to her would be that, from the way I understand it, Taliban has come back to power, and everybody has just gone back to ignoring what's happening in Afghanistan and turning a completely blind eye to it in terms of the international community. I mean, we had an earthquake where more than 3,000 people died, and nobody looks at it. And the Taliban are clearly very much in charge. So what do you think, according to Michaela, are implications of that for India in terms of terrorism and the threat that it poses? Because in the past, whenever Taliban has been really strong in Afghanistan, there have been consequences for India in terms of terrorism. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Tripathi. Ms. Mutawsia, would you like to answer?
First of all, I agree with the fact that action should be taken before such events happen, especially with policies of de-radicalization of society, especially young people, and this means tackling social issues, especially I would say especially poverty and social exclusion. And about Afghanistan, eventually this will grow. Terrorist activities, if nothing is done in Afghanistan, probably this will have an influence in India as well. I think Mr. Qureshi is more keen on this issue. So if you don't mind, I can pass it to him.
Certainly. Mr. Qureshi, sir?
Thank you, Prem. And it's a very interesting discussion. I've been listening. And I think why Michaela passed this on to me is because Mr. Tripathi, of course, referred to earlier instances of Afghanistan having an implication to India, which I think he might be referring to basically the issue of terrorism in the region of Kashmir, which happened after the Soviet-Afghan war. And I think there are many people like Mr. Tripathi who are wary about the fact that that could happen again. And I think it's a reasonable fear to have. I think at the moment there might not be a fear towards it because what you see in the neighborhood, everyone is trying to gain some foothold in Afghanistan. You even saw, for example, the Indian state, maybe not establishing diplomatic relations, but just looking and sending out feelers, where do we stand? And basically that is, Afghanistan has been a battlefield of influence between India and Pakistan for a long time. I do think that the Chinese are probably, gaining some ground over there because the Chinese, of course, come with a bag full of money without any strings attached. There is no human rights and women's rights, and all this doesn't matter that much. So I don't see it happening now, today, because currently Afghanistan's or the Taliban's main issue, their main challenge is governing. They haven't governed in post 9/11 era. So that will be the main challenge. Now, what I also think that at some point of time in these ostensible, fights or rifts between Taliban and the military establishment of Pakistan, these will ease out at some point of time. I think they are there because of the TTP factor. And, with the Haqqanis in the Taliban government and their very long association and the fact that the Chinese are coming on board, this axis of the establishment, Taliban, Chinese, the TTP will essentially, I guess the more hardened TTP faction will probably be killed or be inducted into Taliban in Afghanistan. And, the less hardened factor will probably be mainstream, like you've seen with the Lashkar, the Jaish, all these people over there. So, but yes, what will become a problem at some point of time is that in the Taliban, you, of course, have different levels of jihadi fighters. So you have one, which is the Qatari-based leadership, and they're having fun. Then you have the second part, which is the ruling elite in Afghanistan. And then you have the third guy who is managing traffic in Kabul. While he joined the Taliban for jihad, he joined the Taliban for a bigger purpose and not to manage traffic. So at some point of time, this will create probably, some tension between the foot soldier of the Taliban and the ruling elite, because they will at some point of time say that, okay, now we have conquered Afghanistan, but, where is the caliphate? We need to go towards, Iran they won't go. maybe at a later stage, but we need to go through Pakistan to the so-called Kafirs living in India. And there, I think at some point of time, there will be a trade-off that certain elements will then be sent, because you don't want them in Lahore and Karachi. You don't want them in Xinjiang. So where do you send them? Currently, I do think that the Indian security apparatus has been tightened, but in South Asia, we have this attitude of at some point of time we let it loose, and then until something happens. Because it was very interesting for me to listen to all this and this connection with the organized crime and ISI. But I was quite surprised that nobody actually mentioned the one incident, which was there was no proof needed over there because it happened in a third country. But the one incident which was very clear of this organized crime nexus, terrorism, and the ISI was, of course, the hijacking in 1999 from Kathmandu. Because in the aftermath of that, the Nepalese authorities kicked out a bunch of diplomats from the embassy in Kathmandu. And again, there is that's why it converges, because there is the Kashmiri element, of course, is that you had this organization, Jammu Kashmir Islamic Front or something. I don't know whether you remember, which carried out the bomb blast in Lajpat Nagar in 1996 during I think elections were being held in Kashmir or in Delhi itself. And this was basically done by a Kashmiri militant together with, as Mr. Tripathi mentioned the name, with Memon. And, so the Kathmandu thing, now it's not there. But why was the Kathmandu thing used? The reason for that was you had clean and already established infrastructure. If you go to Kathmandu, you'll see a million shops of Kashmiri shawls and artifacts and all. While you will see not a million clients over there. But these shops have been there in a row for the last 40 years. And it's true, somewhere in the 70s, many Kashmiris went to establish businesses there. But then in the 90s, these were established businesses, clean records. And there is when the Pakistani intelligence agencies used this, it was also a route used for infiltration because of the lax border controls between Nepal and India. So normally, you had these terrorists coming through the Himalayas and the LOC. And at some point of time, it was, I guess, it was Memon together with a guy called Hilal Beg. They created this new route of, Karachi, Dubai, Kathmandu, and then you went on a driving license into India. So in terms of, I think this is my personal opinion, but I think the Indian establishment in the beginning were a bit too naive to think that they might get cozy with the Taliban and then Pakistan will be out. I don't think that will happen. I think the Taliban at that moment engaged not only with the Indians, but with everyone in order to get some legitimacy and get some aid going on. But now you see that the dust has settled. They are very much hand in glove with the Chinese. They've signed oil deals. And I think, if I'm not wrong, CPAC got in, the Taliban included itself in CPAC. And that's very interesting. Not in the BRI, but in the CPAC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or not the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's where you see, for example, Michela's home country, Italy, dropped from the BRI. So at some point of time, this isolation for the Taliban will have repercussions, and at some point of time, the lower ranking people will say, we didn't do this, to become clerks. We want to go to paradise and establish caliphate. So where's the action? And the action then probably will be towards, I hope not, but I do think it will be towards India, specifically towards Kashmir and maybe Punjab, which are the regular thing you think of. What we must not forget, you have a big presence of China in Myanmar and that side. So it could also be, and China has been known to supporting northeastern groups in India. I do think because of there's no religion element there. So the Taliban might not be interested, but just fighting the infidels is maybe good enough for them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Qureshi, because that's why it's so valuable to have you here. So you brought in the Nepal element, which, as you correctly said, none of us mentioned, and that I think was a very crucial point of discussion. Just very quickly, because we're almost out of time. Ms. Mutavsiev, do you have any questions for Mr. Tripathi?
I had quick question for him. So I said before that I think that terrorist organizations and criminal groups should be tackled simultaneously. And I wanted to ask him, in your experience, I know you followed and you covered the trials. Do you think this happened?
It doesn't happen. I mean, the organized crime groups are almost seen as, they're so deeply entrenched. It's like, we all know the criminal element in our family who nobody likes, and something needs to be done about them. But at the same time, that guy gets nice gifts for some people in the family, and then the idea of dealing with that person always gets kicked into the future sometime till they go and do something completely psycho and mad. Right. And then you say, how did we even allow this guy to come home? Now, it does not. And the reasons for that are many, and they are complex. And I think a lot of it comes down to complicity and corruption, which is something that we don't want to look at, because it is always much easier to have a very strong, muscular national narrative of external threats than to try and understand that the wicked problems, as they're called in criminology, exist within the system, and they are much, much harder to take care of, especially in the South Asian context. But it has its consequences, and even though we have a short memory and we keep ignoring them, unless it's tackled, it will still have that cycle. But I don't think there is much motivation, because all in all, it's also very convenient and very profitable for a lot of people involved.
Thank you, Dr. Tripathi. We're almost out of time. So I would just like to make one very quick observation, if I may. One of the formulas that proved to work in Punjab in the 1980s and 1990s for the police was to fuse intelligence on three topics: counter-terrorism, counter-narcotics, and counter-espionage. Actually, the espionage angle is because Pakistan's ISI was involved in supporting the terrorism in Punjab. The narcotics element because of the logistics angle, and of course, counterterrorism is self-evident. Previously, they had treated these three subjects in silos, but when they brought everything together, they developed a very comprehensive assessment, which allowed them to then prioritize which areas they were going to strike in operationally, and that enhanced the capability of the Indian state by a significant factor. Whereas, as you said, when you don't deal with your domestic issues, you can complain as much as you like about foreign elements, but, first you need to get your own house in order. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists. This, for me, was an extremely interesting session. And I also know that you all took the time and trouble to get up early in the morning in Europe. So thank you all very much.